I'll try to make it. No promises. Yeah. Mark 5, verses 21 through 34. When Jesus had crossed again into the boat to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. And then one of the leaders of the synagogue, a man named Jairus, came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at Jesus' feet. And he pleaded with Jesus repeatedly. He said, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So Jesus went with him. And a large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. And there was this woman who was suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years. And she had endured much under many physicians. And she had spent all that she had. And she was no better, but grew worse. She'd heard about Jesus. And so she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I just touch his cloak, I'll be made well." And immediately the flow of blood stopped. And she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that power had gone out from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my cloak?" And the disciples said to him, "Jesus, you see the crowd pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus looked all around to see who had done it. And the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." That's the end of the reading. Let's take a look at a couple slides. I was often like to share artists' rendering of some of these stories, and it was hard to find any of this that I really liked. Most of them made the woman look too pathetic for my taste, as you'll see. But this one is actually a church that was so moved by their understanding of this story that they made an entire wall. They made this huge painting, artistic rendering of, and you can just see her just touching the hem of the garden at his feet. Interesting interpretation. And one more. Oh, this one, actually, I thought I had taken it out, but there we go. And we always try to find non-white dominated art. And I love this one. Okay. So those of you who got the Pulse, our weekly electronic newsletter, and if you don't receive that and you would like to, please let me know. Give me your name and your email address. I'll make sure you get it. Those of you who do get it, please read it. No, I mean, up to you. But at least make sure it comes into your primary folder and not your promotions, okay? But I shared the entire joke that I didn't get to last week, but I thought, to me, it was hysterical. I thought it was very funny. It was a little too political for last week, but since, we're exhaling a bit this week, here's just a few of my favorite parts. It's connected to the chicken farm and the old joke question, perennial question, why did the chicken cross the road? So here are a few responses from various political and cultural figures. Donald Trump. I've been told that by many sources, good sources, they're very good sources, that the chicken crossed the road. All the fake news wants us to do is to write nasty things about the road, but it's a totally good road. It's a beautiful road. Everyone knows how beautiful it is. Right. Joe Biden. Why did the chicken do the thing in the, oh, you know the rest. Sarah Palin. The chicken crossed the road because, gosh darn it, he's a maverick. Barack Obama. Let me be perfectly clear. If the chickens like their eggs, they can keep their eggs. No chicken will be required to cross the road to surrender her eggs, period. Dick Cheney. Where's my gun? Bill Clinton. I did not cross the road with that chicken. Yeah. Al Gore. I invented the chicken. Dr. Phil. The problem we have here is that this chicken won't realize that he must first deal with the problem on this side of the road before it's good. He goes after the problem on the other side of the road. What we need is to help him realize how stupid he is by not taking on his current problems before adding on any new problems. Dr. Seuss. Did the chicken cross the road? Did he cross it with a toad? Yes, the chicken crossed the road. Why it crossed the road, we've not been told. Ernest Hemingway, To Die in the Rain Alone. Grandpa, in my day, we didn't ask why the chicken crossed the road. Somebody told us the chicken crossed the road, and that was good enough for us. And finally, Colonel Sanders. Did I miss one? All right. Has nothing to do with our sermon, but I can't let a good joke pass. All right. The rest of it is in the Pulse. The story, and by the way, I'm looking at the clock. Yeah, we're not going to get out here at the hour. So everybody take a nice deep breath. If you got to go, right? I don't know what kickoff is until 3:30, right? The story we just read from Mark's gospel is a healing story. And I just want to acknowledge before I touch it how complicated that stuff is. The whole question of faith healing. Personally, I do believe that healing, including mysterious and inexplicable physical healings, can and sometimes do happen. But the operative word is sometimes. And it's just such a great mystery how that works. And so I have nothing but respect. And sometimes there's a difference between healing and cure. You might not be cured, but healing might come through how an illness is dealt with. Might come in the form of being given the grace and the strength and the joy even to live courageously with a condition that won't just go away. So I just had to acknowledge, if you're facing something difficult right now, this is not going to be a sermon about faith healing. So either let that go or hold it very loosely. The story from Mark, though, tells us some important things about both Jesus and this woman. To begin with, there is one detail that's easy to miss. And that is that Jesus was first approached by the leader of the synagogue, a guy named Jairus. He was a prominent man, would have been well known, well respected, kind of a power broker in the town. Everybody would have known him. He was a religious authority figure who, by the way, were the only ones that Jesus clashed with pretty consistently. Religious know-it-alls. But it is interesting how, even though as a rule or in a general sense, most of the religious authorities by this time were not a fan of Jesus. That when your baby girl gets sick, has a way of cutting through all the stuff, doesn't it? And so Jairus, a daddy, comes and kneels before Jesus and says, my daughter's sick. I think she's dying. Please come and heal her. And so Jesus goes. But I don't want us to miss the fact that this encounter with the woman in the story that we're about to focus on happens while he's on the way to the leader's house. The leader, Jairus, did show some humility, but he probably also presumed that he would have access to Jesus, which is one of the hallmarks of privilege, and white privilege in particular, as is often pointed out, the presumption of access. And there are all kinds of patriarchal and power broker privilege points we could get into. I don't have time. I just want us to notice that this encounter happened while Jesus, with the bleeding woman that we're about to look at, while he's on the way to the leader's house, and the contrast between the daughter of power and privilege and this woman with no power and no inside connections is a message in itself. So let's look at this woman for a minute. All we know about her is that she suffered from a flow of blood for 12 years and that she'd tried everything to get well, including spending all her money on physicians, and nothing worked. But here's what we can deduce also from what we do know about her. She was probably extremely isolated because in that time, any kind of bleeding, especially the female kind of bleeding, rendered a person ritually unclean and impure in that culture. Anyone with an open wound who was bleeding in any way would not be able to participate in any religious services or ceremonies or rituals. A woman whose flow would not stop would not be permitted to live with others or to move around freely. She'd be isolated and alone, either completely or with other people who were also isolated. In addition to being isolated, she would have been considered toxic, dangerous, contagious. If a bleeding person touched someone else or was touched by someone else, the person who touched the bleeding person would also be considered impure and unclean and have to spend at least a week outside the camp doing various things to get ritually pure again. So they had to stay away from others in order not to make them unclean. You know, if you've had COVID, you've had just a taste of this. I had it in September, a little back-to-back case. And, you know, once I wasn't sick, the hardest part about the whole thing was just being isolated and also feeling like I was dangerous to other people. I mean, a number of you have had it. Wasn't that a weird feeling? Just feeling like, gosh, you know, it's not really safe for anybody to be around me. We'll multiply that a zillion times to try to understand what this woman went through for 12 years. So she's isolated, feeling toxic, getting the message, you are dangerous to everybody else. And then on top of that, there'd be a heavy dose of shame. There was a very strong tendency in first century Palestine to assume that if someone was sick in some way, it was their own darn fault. They were being punished. They must have done something wrong to deserve this. And I'd like to think that we don't do that to ourselves anymore. But isn't it amazing when something happens, or things aren't going well, or you have that diagnosis, how quick we are to blame ourselves? Did I do something wrong? And, you know, so there is a correlation between health and our actions. I mean, usually there's some obvious things that we can do to live a more healthy life. If you're not, and you're not in alignment with that, then by all means, make some changes. But if and when you get sick, do not blame yourself. And certainly don't imagine that God is punishing you. It's just not true. All right, back to the woman. She must have heard about Jesus. And I'm sure she had tried religion in every which way she possibly could. And all that got her was more guilty and condemned and cast aside. Why was she hiding in the story? In addition to shame, which always causes us to hide, she wouldn't have been allowed out in public. These towns were not huge. Everybody would have known her. 12 years. She was the woman who, you know, don't go near her. She's not supposed to be out with the rest of the folks. So why was she in hiding that day? Probably covered up completely. She didn't want people to know she was there. And she didn't want to mess things up for anybody else, including Jesus, probably, by touching him and getting him in trouble. Okay, somehow she heard, like Jairus, that Jesus could heal people. She either saw it for herself or heard about it. One way or another, she got this feeling like there's something different about this guy, Jesus. This guy has some power. And you know, I mean, there's still something different about Jesus as far as I'm concerned. The risen Christ, who, if the story is true, is here in the spirit among us. There is something powerful and beautiful and healing and liberating about the real Jesus, the one who never shames or judges or excludes anyone, the one who's still with us. So back to the woman. And I'm coming in for a landing. Almost. This is what I want us to see today. This was one resilient, bad A woman who refused to give up, who refused to take no for an answer, who refused to let her years of failed attempts to make a change discourage her to the point of giving up. She showed courage and tenacity and believed that this guy, Jesus, from what she'd heard and had maybe seen, had something from God that was stronger than whatever it was that was making her sick. And maybe she thought to myself, I can't touch his body, but if I can just even touch his clothes, I know I could be healed. I'm just amazed that she still hoped at all after 12 years, let alone was that resilient and that willing to go out of her way to do whatever she possibly could to make contact with him. So you know what happens, right? She gets out there. She somehow comes up behind him. She touches the cloak of his garment. And all of a sudden, Jesus stops in the midst of a crowd and says, "Who touched me?" And the disciples are, "What do you mean, who touched you? We're in a crowd, Jesus. Everybody's touching you. They're reaching out to you." Everybody was trying to get a piece of him. He said, "No, who touched me?" And he said, "I felt power." The Greek word is dunamis, the same root we get dynamite from. Something explosive went out from me. Something just happened. There was a connection made. I felt it. Who touched me? And when the woman realized he's not going to let her sneak away unacknowledged, she comes and kneels down in front of him and says, everything. Tells him the whole story. And then his first word, he looks at her, and I would have given anything to be present and to see the look on their face as she took off the covering, probably, and looked into his eyes. And he looks at her and he says, "Daughter." I mean, come on. He's on the way to the big house to heal the big man's daughter. But he stops and says to this woman, who for all intents and purposes was a nobody and a nothing, he says, "You are God's daughter. And don't you forget it." Well, that may seem like nothing at all to you, but somehow I just find it amazing. And then he says to her, "Your faith has made you well." And it hit me as I was reading this week that maybe faith is all the things we do, hoping to make that connection, longing for a change. But it's not about sitting around and waiting for God to do something or for somebody else to do something for us. But you hustle, you do everything you possibly can to do your part to increase the likelihood that the connection might happen through which God can do something. And I'm going to close by just saying, I chose this because it reminded me of our friends in Haiti. As Karen mentioned, they are under amazing turmoil and suffering right now. And I've known some of them for 20, 30 years. Amazingly resilient in the face of incredible ongoing suffering and hopelessness. But they have faith. And I mean, you know, I'm gonna leave it there. I was going to sing "I See You" for Karen for you, but it's too late. I'll sing it for you afterwards if you really want to hear it. But may we all be inspired when things get difficult, or feel like there's no point, to keep doing what is ours to do, so that we increase the likelihood that God can do something beyond what we can do. I'll leave it there. Amen.